Hi, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Squall Growth Podcast. I have a great guest today, Peter Fishman, CEO and co-founder of Mozart Data. Peter, welcome to the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Great to be here.
So, Peter, I would love to hear a little bit about your story. You've been with many great companies along this journey in tech, and would love to hear how you got into tech, and then how you got into startups.
Sure. So, it all ties through. From those companies. I started my sort of tech career when I was in grad school. So, when I was in grad school, I actually had a few internships with some tech companies, fell in love with the Bay Area, and then ultimately decided that I wanted to stay here. And if you want to stay in the Bay Area, there's really one choice, which is you work in tech. And at the time, actually, it was interesting. My PhD was all about using data and data sets and trying to find inference and trying to find causality and relationships. And I don't think there was really a big uh, you know sort of practice amongst most tech companies in terms of doing that. Experimentation was starting to get legs, but at the end of the day, I think most companies were sort of technology companies, mostly interested in their product, not really understanding some of the behaviors that were driving some of their key metrics. Over the past 15 or 20 years, since I sort of joined the industry, there's really been an incredible amount of one, data being captured. So it started with the ability to capture data pretty inexpensively, and then from there, I've kind of seen it create a lot of different types of jobs that are very much aligned with my skills. At the time, it was pretty rare for companies to offer those types of jobs, but now they're very common, and they've really provided a lot of value in the last 10, 15 years in terms of just sort of seeing how my profession and my practice has grown.
It's really interesting, and this is something that has really been a revolution in marketing, where there's the hypothesis experiment, but that measure side was always focus groups, empirical, and really, which we're still very important today, but there was a lot of more fluff in terms of that measurement. And hey, is our marketing dollars effective? Is our sales team effective? How have you kind of see that accelerating right now?
Well, sort of like the classic cliche is, 50% of my marketing is working. I just don't know which 50%. So, when I was getting started, my my first job in tech was in video games on the Facebook platform. And, um, very often we would sort of run right nav. Now, of course, everything's in the feed, but at the time, people would run right nav ads trying to get somebody's attention with a clever tagline or a great image. And we could sit and debate the merits of the image for hours. And then you'd say, this one's better, or this one's better, or this one's better. And then you could put it up on Facebook, and within a few minutes, you would know which of the varieties was clearly the best. So that really led in that industry to a prevalence of testing, split testing, A/B or multivariate testing, and then ultimately that's become very common, across everyone in tech. But really, yeah, I love the fact that the challenge had always been, how do you get someone creative to be more quantitative? And
Mm.
now I think it's like, how do you infuse creativity to your quantitative strategy? So typically a quantitative strategy is how much to spend on a certain marketing campaign, and what's your expected ROAS, or what's your payback period, or what's your CAC to LTV. And then around that, how can you build the best creatives that basically make that ratio as good as possible?
Absolutely. And I think it's really interesting to see that pendulum that was so far out on, the creative side of the marketing world. And now it's swung so much on the quantitative. It feels almost that you need to have, how can you help quantitative people be creative?
So
So
I don't want to, I certainly don't want to diminish the role of creativity because
yeah,
um, a a lackluster campaign can't be micro optimized to winning. So
yeah,
you can't take something that's not connecting with the customer, that doesn't sort of that doesn't work, and then make a bunch of small improvements and then expect the net is going to work. That said, I actually often dislike that characterization of what analytics does. In fact, if anything, it's more to encourage big, broad bets that are very creative, that are sort of very out there, because we can measure that and we can know what's working, and then we can, you know, shrink the budgets of the things that aren't working, and then enhance the budgets of the things that are. So I really do think create, they both play a role. So I don't want to be the quant that comes in and says, just try to find little improvements in your click-throughs, or your in your something down funnel. That's not really how I think about the world. I think about the world as, when you can measure things, it's like, I often say there's a law in analytics that we call Pearson's law, which is that which is measured improves. So often what I say, if myself or a friend is trying to lose some weight, I think the most effective tool for losing weight is not a diet, not exercise, but literally just owning a scale and stepping on the scale. Because that way you're thinking about it, you're sort of mindful of it, and at the very least, when you're making progress or not. And in some sense, there's been this sort of like turf war over who owns marketing. Is it the quants or the creatives? But in practice, I think it's a real important job of the quants to provide a really great scale, so that everybody in marketing can do their thing.
I absolutely. And I mean, a lot of times where I've been deployed and we go and serve a company, right? And the number one piece of advice that we often leave people with is like, it's like, hey, how do we improve conversion rate, AOV, profit, CAC, like all these different metrics, right? And all these different things. But then the number one thing I often see that's lacking in all these companies is just measuring that metric on a daily basis and reporting it out on Slack, Teams, like making sure everyone in the company sees. Because I think that there's the measurement and then there's the accountability on that. And if you're measuring every day and you have accountability on your metrics every day, reporting out to the CEO and everyone, right, in a like public way, that number is going to get going, and the team responsible for those numbers is going to feel the heat.
Yeah, and I think even just its existence makes people cognizant of it, and makes them extra think, hey, is this decision going to move that metric that's going out there? So it's so while accountability, I think accountability falls into this big sort of bucket of externalities that come with measure things well. And that bucket basically is all about like a certain social dynamic that happens at the company, where everybody at the company rallies around improving a metric. And when that metric is really like tightly tied with your success, that can be really amazing. If people are constantly thinking about it and aligned on, you get all these externalities like cross company alignment. That very often one of the teams, that's trying something, is really pulling in one direction, and only at an all hands or after the fact or after the success or failure of it does another team learn about it. But I think when you have this measurement, when you have this reporting, when you have this alerting, when it's cheap to produce those metrics, you get a bunch of cultural benefits, and some of them you sort of highlighted.
Yeah, and I think that oftentimes, right, we're always wrong about what will work in marketing. Analytics has given us that our best ideas are often the worst ones. But it's sometimes where if you are putting that problem out there into the universe, then you could see like, Jill from accounting actually has the winning ad creative idea, right? And she'll share it with you, right? And that could be it. So I think it's really interesting to have that metrics, have that reporting out. So then when you're talking to early stage founders about building out their marketing funnels and their analytics and their data, right? What what are you advising them to do? How do they kind of get this going, given that they're stretched for time and usually don't have large teams?
Sure. I mean, I think the important thing is do a few things right as opposed to try to get everything sort of
Mm,
sparkling.
yeah.
You can hire a big data engineering team of a couple dozen people to get really the pristine kind of environment that might be ideal in practice. Most small teams have the budget for either zero or one, data engineers. There have been a bunch of data engineering tools that have come on board that have made data engineering very readily accessible to business operators, to marketers, to marketing ops, to biz ops, SOPs, all of the groups that are sort of living in a CRM, or living in places that are creating data, spreadsheets, CSV files, databases, SaaS tools, again, like your CRM. And I think one of the most important things is moving that data to a data warehouse. So capture the data, capture the events, event tracking. There's a lot of event tools. Try to buy a lot of the off the shelf things. Now, I personally have a company that bundles many of these things together, so I'm a little bit biased. But whether it's our company or other companies, I think the approach of move the data to a central place, clean it up, and just start creating some basic reports. Just the acts of doing those things are going to put you in the 90th percentile. And there's many ways to spin this up. I think many of the ETL tools, including us, make this very easy, very much no code. You don't literally write ETL, you use the tool.
Mm.
And many of the data warehouses have become much more accessible. And then you have sort of bundled all-in-one solutions like Mozart Data, but amongst a sort of sea of others that do that. I think one of the things that's sometimes daunting with data is that many vendors sound like they do the same thing. It's a little bit difficult to distinguish between them. And at the end of the day, everybody says, actionable insights from your data, or, a single source of truth. And that is the place that you're sort of driving towards. And I think the important part of that is moving that data to a central place. And that's kind of the thing that I would sort of plant my flag on.
Yeah, I think so. Let's get into like brass tacks here. Is like setting this up and having this be easy. So there's the theory of taking your data into a data warehouse. Let's say we're doing a mid SMB. They are like I don't know, an agency, like an ad agency, PR, like a service, some kind of service company, right?
Mm-hmm.
They're going in, they got a Salesforce instance running, they got running ads, PPC, Facebook, whatever, right? They got a sales team, SDR,
Mm-hmm.
right? That's producing some and filling in their CRM.
Mm-hmm.
And they got some metrics, they got revenue in accounting on basic QuickBooks, right? How
Mm-hmm.
do they take that sea of data and get it actually and start to create saying, oh, is Google Ads working?
Sure. So, just to flip your question a little bit, I think you start with a question. So, a question might be, is Google Ads working? Another
Yep.
question might be, what's more effective? Another dollar spent on Google Ads or another dollar spent on an SDR?
Yep.
And you can, I think it starts with write down, I'd say somewhere between 2 and 5 questions that you want answered, or that you try to answer today, and it takes you maybe an hour, or maybe 2 hours, or
Mm.
maybe 10 hours to answer it. So I think probably something like, hey, is Google Ads working? I think you're probably trying to answer that today. And there's a great platform for analyzing whether Google Ads are working. It's called Google Ads. So in general, like the ads platform itself will report on some of your main metrics. One of the problems and challenges is that it's sometimes hard to tie in maybe what's the lifetime value of that ad, or what are some of the margins that you make from that ad, or sort of things that are not actually baked into Google,
Yep.
or into the ads platform. You might be able to understand things like basically
SEO.
your CPA, or
Yeah.
whatever the metric that you're trying to, based on if you set up the tags properly. But you mentioned a couple of systems. You mentioned QuickBooks, and you mentioned Google
Sa-
Ads, and you mentioned
Salesforce, right?
Salesforce. These are very vanilla tools. So if you're in tech, you should be using these tools. In fact, we're somebody that uses literally all of the tools that you just mentioned. And so it's moving that data is a very vanilla problem. Now, if you told me that your CRM was like zippity doo dah, like I've actually never heard of that CRM. I don't know kind of the API availability, so I don't quite know maybe how to move from a more obscure place. But if you're using pretty vanilla tools, which you probably should be, you should be reinventing the wheel on your business, not on other parts of your business. So, don't try to be, building, a kind of, you mentioned like a services company that also is trying to reinvent, how, gap accounting works. Just really, it's really how do you focus on the thing that you do excellent, and typically that means buying pretty vanilla, pretty like tried and true tools. When you do that, it's very easy to move them to one of the standard sort of cloud data warehouses. There are a number of ETL vendors. I have a favorite, Mozart Data, but there are a number of vendors that literally specialize in no-code tools that on a schedule, so that you don't have to maintain it, uh, move and check for changes in your data, and then essentially move your data to a data warehouse where you can cut it, slice it, clean it, join it, query it to your heart's content, and create reports downstream in a BI tool, and have this all be magically connected so that when something changes, when one of your AEs goes into Salesforce and changes an opportunity from qualified opportunity to in negotiation, or closed loss, or whatever that thing is, you want that to populate downstream in a report. You don't want to have to essentially download that data, do a lookup in Excel or some sort of match, and then sort of repivot it and then summarize it. That's really not, I think there's just sort of modern tools that just make this incredibly magic. So again, I have my own set of favorites. I think one of the inspirations for our tool was we had done this exact process probably almost a dozen times between myself and Dan. And this was the tool chain that we really liked using, that we felt was really empowering the types of early and late stage companies that we had been at. And we wanted to make that very accessible to people without a budget for a data engineer.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think though it's so funny to see because in that funnel, right? A lot of times, like you're doing a startup is trying to build their a B2B like enterprise sales startup, right? So it's a little bit longer sales cycle, a little bit more complex, right? Than just like click the ad and click buy, a bombs up SaaS, right? And so I think this is where the data gets interesting because you can be running again Facebook ads, TikTok, and then you have like Google ads closing, right? But then how can you actually get it's down to that attribution? Where are you spending money? How are you scaling it? Because the TikTok ad actually might be getting you the initial impression, but then the Google ad is going through. And then is it the SDR who's then saying, okay, marketing qualified lead to sales qualified lead, right? And thinking about that. And I think that's where a big challenge is for stock marketers is to get sandy here when there's just it gets complex with a very I just mentioned a very simple setup.
In this incredibly simple case, I would say the most cutting edge technology for doing attribution is going to do it pretty wrong, but also
Yep.
pretty right. So I don't have a lot of optimism that in the next 5 years, 10 years, even 20 years, I mean, these statements always come back to bite you, but I don't have a lot of optimism that, perfect attribution will be solved by then. And that's because it is a little bit hard to get into the customer's mind who gets the credit for it. I will say that when you go to individual vendors and their tools, they disproportionately take credit for it. So if you were to ask maybe Facebook who got that win for your sales team, they would say, well, who served them the first impression? Instagram. So therefore, Instagram gets the credit. It's like, well, if you were to ask Google, it's like, well, how did they land on the web page? Google would say they did a Google search. It's like, so Google gets the credit.
And just
And
and anyone
yeah,
listening on Google today, right on that point, Facebook attribution is a de facto 7-day click window. And Google has changed this, I believe. And now they are default, and most people don't catch this, they are default 30-day click window. By default, they're getting 30 days.
so now, I mean, those I don't find that deceptive because there is some degree of truth in it, right? So the reason that I landed on this page was I did Google it. That said, I think that if you're not careful, you'll have given credit to 200% of your wins. So I think that I think we're sort of a ways away from solving attribution really well. And I think being cognizant of it, being thoughtful about it, putting that data into a central place so that you can max assign one win. And you might partially assign to the first impression or the last impression or an average, or all of the impressions get the same weight, or you extra weight that, you could do something complicated. You could do some really advanced statistical modeling to understand, which impression should get the credit. At the end of the day, I think it's just important that one win is one win, and you figure out the sources of that win, and what ultimately drove that customer to you. So I think just sort of, again, being aware of this problem is probably about half the battle. And any of the techniques that you use, first impression, last impression, average, or just immediate, it doesn't even matter. So any of these sort of approaches will get you closer to a reality that I think is probably going to improve and enhance your ROAS over the long haul.
So you have a bunch of startups that are using Mozart, and you've been able to bring this, traditionally very expensive resource, that was out of the reach of a startup budget, into their hands. How are you seeing start marketing teams, startups, founders using your tools and getting insights that were not yet possible, that weren't possible before for a startup to achieve?
Sure. And again, I think you hit the first point, which is actually, companies have been doing this for a decade. But those companies tend to be very well resourced late stage companies. So they would hire someone like me, and I would go write a big check to one of the big cloud providers, and then I would have a really powerful data warehouse at my disposal and my team, and I would be able to sort of cut things and answer things, and marketers would sort of write us Slack messages, or they would come to our desk and say, hey, could you help me figure out whether or not my campaign's working? That's just, sort of having transitioned to much more startup centric, always sort of had a startup mentality. Dan, my co-founder, had always worked at sort of early stage startups. He had done a few of the accelerators himself before we did sort of the company together. So I think he always had that mentality. Again, we do something that's been around for a while, and we just do it. We make it easier, faster, cheaper, and I think that really is kind of what we want to think of as our claim to fame. I also want to say that I don't want to talk about data pipelines or data infrastructure, because while that's in practice what we do, I think of it more as, how do you win with your data? So how do you find insights out of it? And technically we think the way that you get there is you pipe your data the appropriate way so that you have reliable, tables to use downstream. And then, you have to do the hard work, which is thinking about the right questions for your business. I mean, I think we just hit on something. If you're a company that's doing some Google ads, but also has some SDRs and maybe some Facebook ads, a really important marketing question, if you're the CMO, if you're anybody on the marketing team, is, should I spend another dollar on somebody to do outbounding. Should I spend it on an outbounding tool? Should I spend it on an ad? Which ad? Should I spend on which ad platform? And I think the world sends you very confusing and noisy signals about it. And one of the important revolutions that made our product possible, and I think is very good for the startup marketer, is that so much of data now is consumption based. So rather than saying, okay, well, we're going to, you're going to make better ads decisions. And then, because you're making better ads decisions, you're going to save 10, 20, 30, 50% of your ads budget. And, we should figure out, okay, how do we build a tool and, that can help you save that? And then let's just take a slice from there. Instead, sort of more the modern tools are saying, hey, if you have just very little data, you
Mhm.
pay generally very little. If you have like lots and lots of data, you pay more or lots. So this is really nice for startups, mostly because when you're sort of paying a fixed fee, you're competing with bigger companies that have all the resources to sort of pay that amount and then save that money. Today, and Mozart certainly wasn't the team that revolutionized this. This was much more, folks like Snowflake and Google and Fivetran and all these companies that really sort of figured out, okay, um, we should charge in proportion to the value we're creating. And there are good signals of how much value we're creating. Typically, in the data warehouse case, it's how much compute are you doing? How many sort of rows are you bringing in? How active are people in terms of using those? So a lot of this stuff, I think is really great for the modern startup because one of the things that we've seen is that we love growing with companies. So companies get on typically either our smallest plan or our free plan, and then from there, their data volumes increase because they're using a bunch of data. They need to sort of analyze new data sets. They need to bring in more data, and they scale up their data consumption. So it's kind of a win, not based on like a sales motion, but based on experiencing some value from not just Mozart the product, but from like sort of data more broadly.
Mm, very cool. So, Peter, what kind of last piece of advice do you have for startups today and how to get ahead for start marketers and founders start to
Yeah.
utilize their data?
Well, I mean, so the first piece of advice, we touched on it, which was basically have really like an experimentation or beginner's mindset. So kind of start from a place, on the product side. I was recently quoting a piece of Reid Hoffman advice, which is like, if you're not embarrassed about sort of the product that you initially release, you've sort of waited too long. It's a famous Reid Hoffman quote. And I think that there's something analogous in the sort of marketing space. Now, I'm not suggesting all the marketers should put out really terrible, creative. I would just say that you should be experimenting a lot. You should have some losers in your bag. I mean, hopefully you don't go with an intentional loser, but you should be experiencing some very big losers in terms of bets that you've made. And the key is just sort of how do you very quickly pivot off of them? And if you have a process and a culture that sort of encourages sort of these failures, it will, of course, be a long run very helpful.
I love that advice, and my analogy for that I love to bring up to people is you got to be the Beatles. The Beatles produced albums between 1964 and 1970, and they dropped 231 songs. That averages to about 2.1 songs per month that they shipped. Two
Great.
songs, two Beatles songs every month.
Yeah.
And then how many ads did you make? How many landing pages did you make this month? Be the Beatles.
So one more piece of advice around being the Beatles is, Pete Best was a member of the Beatles. He was the drummer,
Yeah.
and that wasn't working. And ultimately, Ringo is the fourth Beatle. So
Hmm.
I think sort of yes, it's like do the stint that they did in Germany where they're producing all the songs, then ultimately come back and just put out song after song after song, and then you're gonna have some of the most the all time classics. And I think like that, I mean, it's a great analogy. It also, by the way, in that case, doesn't hurt, to have three of the greatest musicians of all time, sort of, on the team. So, but I think at the highest level, I'm a big fan of put a lot out into the world and see what's working, and obviously double down into those things.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Cool. Pierre, it was great to have you on the show. Thank you so much for talking with us.
Amazing, great to be here. Thanks for